Right. Hello, room, and hello, internet. My name is Adam Holmes. I am the Assistant Director of the W.E.B. Du Bois Center, and when my colleagues approached me about doing a talk for Love Data Week, I thought this would be a great opportunity to revisit an increasingly well-known and visually iconic part of Du Bois's long and amazing career, the data visualizations or infographics, data portraits, which he produced for the 1900 Paris Exposition. And I think this is a remarkable story in its own right. I think it has so much to tell us about the life and work of Du Bois, but also it carries significance beyond that. So I hope that you'll sort of allow me to take you on a bit of a journey through Du Bois's early life, and we'll culminate in 1900 with this quite remarkable show. My own background is a blend of non-profit operational work, running programs here and in the UK with a strong social justice focus, and in history and American studies. As such, the concept of science, data, and numbers frightens me a little bit. So I hope you'll forgive me if I sound sometimes rather unscientific in my approach. And I hope Du Bois does too, for that matter. In any case, we are here today to talk about Du Bois in Paris at the turn of the last century. Here he is. This was his identification card for the exposition. In 1900, Du Bois was 32 years old. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall with a lightly muscular build. He had already achieved enormous renown as a scholar at this point, although his young life was one filled with both triumphs and tragedies. He was a somewhat reserved New England gentleman with definite European airs. I definitely can't relate to that. So the world's fairs, we are familiar with them, I guess, from history, from media, from movies, from going to art exhibits. They are famously jingoistic, nationalist, imperialist. The fair, in Alden Morris's word, presented a global stage for nations to strut their sense of national pride. And the Paris Exposition, the Exposition Universelle, was no different. It spanned 280 acres on both sides of the Seine in Paris, from the Eiffel Tower to the Place de la Concorde. There were enormous, opulent pavilions everywhere one looked, including a Russian one with a gigantic marble and jasper map of France with its cities marked by precious stones. The function of world's fairs, in the words of the great art historian Robert Hughes, were as festivals of high machine age capitalism, in which nation after nation showed off its industrial strength and the breadth of its colonial resources. Du Bois himself referred to this fair as one of the finest, perhaps the very finest, of world expositions. It typified what the European world wanted to think of itself and its future. There is a definite presence, an uncomfortable presence in these fairs of colonialism, and more than that, of a despicable racism and social Darwinism in the shape of the anthropological, to use a kind word, displays in the pavilions. One could also talk about human zoos, and definitely looted indigenous artifacts. The European race is being presented as lifting the rest of the world up out of barbarism and backwardness. So in this, Du Bois has to act as something of an insurgent. His Exposition des Nègres d'Amérique, the exhibit of American Negroes, was first organized and conceived of by Thomas Junius Calloway, a lawyer, educator, Fisk University graduate, and editor of the Colored American newspaper in Washington, D.C. the show was also supported and endorsed by Booker T. Washington. Callaway had petitioned the US government to include an exhibit within its pavilion dedicated to African American life in a space which otherwise celebrated industrial and imperial prowess. Callaway invited Du Bois to contribute a social study of Black life to the exhibit. He said to Du Bois, "Thousands upon thousands will go to the fair, and a well-selected and prepared exhibit presenting the Negro's development in his churches, his schools, his homes, his farms, his stores, his professions, and pursuits in general will attract attention and do a great and lasting good in convincing thinking people of the possibilities of the Negro." Du Bois's social study would become the most enduring and well-known part of the exhibit, the American exhibit, that is, showcasing his newfound commitment to public scholarship and his lifelong campaign for racial justice. The show would leave a lasting impression on all who saw it and revolutionize the techniques of data visualization in the process. The key themes we'll be exploring today include: 1, what made this exhibit, and specifically the data portraits, so special? What they can tell us about Du Bois's approach to data collection, analysis, and presentation. 2, we'll be exploring the idea of modernity itself and what this show had to say about Black people and their place in the modern world. We'll also look at how this exhibit challenged notions still held today about how modernism, or the modern style, developed. And 3, I'm going to argue that this exhibit marks a pivot point in Du Bois's career. It represents almost the exact moment that he abandoned a life of pure academic scholarship, research, and teaching in favor of a broader mission to lead a world movement for social justice. But before we explore Du Bois's data portraits, we must first go over his story so far. It is vital for us to understand both what allowed Du Bois to be in the position to put together this exhibit and how his own life experience informed his curatorial approach. So, to go back to the very beginning, William Edward Burckhardt Du Bois was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts on February the 23rd, 1868, to Mary Sylvina Burckhardt and Alfred Du Bois. Alfred disappeared from the story very early. We don't fully realize what happened to him, so Du Bois was raised by his mother's family, the Burckharts. And in case you're in doubt about how the last name is pronounced, I always like to present this piece, which is not in our collection here at UMass, actually. It's in a private collection in Great Barrington, but where it very clearly, in Du Bois's own handwriting, shows that it is not pronounced the French way, despite our Parisian focus today, but very clearly, Du Bois. Here he is in the Great Barrington High School class of 1884, the only Black student, the victim of subtle and genteel New England racism, which I'm sure many people to this day can recognize. And these are the words of Alden Morris. And he recounts this in The Souls of Black Folk, where he talks about being refused, being the victim of microaggressions and acts of anti-Blackness in the classroom, and having this prompted him to seek to do better than his classmates. He said that it dawned upon him that he was different from the others, that he was shut out from their world by a vast veil. He says, I had thereafter no desire to tear down that veil, to creep through. I held all beyond it in common contempt, and lived above it in a region of blue sky and great wandering shadows. Du Bois did not shrink in the face of racism. He rose to meet it, and rose indeed above it. Frank Hosmer, the teacher there in the beard, was a big believer in Du Bois and his brilliance. And other wealthy members of Great Barrington Society crowdfunded, essentially, to help send Du Bois to university. Du Bois himself, of course, also applied for and won scholarship funds. He was torn about leaving, but when his mother died when he was 18, and she had been in poor health for a while, it's sad to say, Du Bois, now orphaned, felt that he at least had the freedom to go out into the world. And the place he chose to go, having initially dreamed of going to Harvard, I'm contractually obliged at this point to say that other universities in Massachusetts are available, he finally settled on Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. He wrote in his magnificent autobiography, Dusk of Dawn, written in 1940, "Here and immediately was adventure. I was going into the South of slavery, rebellion, and black folk. And above all, I was going to meet colored people of my own age and education, of my own ambitions." This letter that I've printed a portion of here, which is in our archive, is written at the time. And I think it speaks to Du Bois's enormous excitement at being among large numbers of black people his own age for the first time. He's writing to Reverend Scudder back in Great Barrington. He says, "Our university is very pleasantly situated, overlooking the city. Some mornings, as I look out upon the 200 or 300 of my companions assembled for morning prayers, I can hardly realize they are all my people, that this great assembly of youth and intelligence are the representatives of a race which 20 years ago was in bondage." Fisk, it is fair to say, ignites something in Du Bois. It brings him fully into consciousness as a black man in the late 19th century. He learns the folkways. He is intoxicated by the music. He falls in love with the culture. He also experiences in the hills of Tennessee real rural poverty in black communities. He goes out there to teach in the summer, and he starts to, I think, the ideas of wanting to study these populations starts to take hold in his mind. He does finally make it to Harvard, of course, and becomes in the process the first black man to graduate from that school with a PhD. Now, it's interesting that later in life, Du Bois is supposed to have quipped when introduced as the first black man with a PhD from Harvard, "The pleasure, I assure you, was Harvard's." And this is perhaps because he was treated as a bit of a second-class citizen on some levels, and on other levels he was tokenized as a brilliant non-white student. This was an infuriating experience, and one which he met again with that contemptuous superiority which he'd showed to his Great Barrington classmates. And he also chose to absent himself and take himself off to Germany, where he spent 2 years in the 1890s. So despite having wonderful teachers like William James, who became a great mentor of Du Bois, and experiencing all the brilliance of Harvard, he still felt compelled to leave the US, go to Europe. And as he wrote later, "Europe modified profoundly my outlook on life and my thought and feeling toward it, even though I was there but 2 short years. In Germany, I found myself on the outside of the American world looking in. With me were white folk, students, acquaintances, teachers who viewed the scene with me. They did not always pause to regard me as a curiosity or something subhuman. I was just a man of the somewhat privileged student rank with whom they were glad to meet and talk over the world, particularly the part of the world whence I came." So what Du Bois is telling us in this memoir is that Europe sort of awakened him to the possibilities of a world without the color line, at least as it applied to him, and also allowed him to take a step, again, having already used the veil metaphor, now he's stepping outside of the US entirely and taking a sort of bird's eye view and seeing American culture for what it really is. And being, I think, interested in his European colleagues' interest. And he's also, I think, inspired by his time in Europe. He leans into his pre-existing interest in European arts, literature, music, and so on. Wagner, he liked him, which is obviously interesting. And he starts to adopt some of the affectations that we will associate with the older Du Bois, the 3-piece suit, the goatee, the white gloves, the cane. And he comes back to the US, having run out of his scholarship funds. He doesn't hang around long at Harvard. He goes straight to Wilberforce University in Ohio, which is an unremarkable time in Du Bois's life academically. It's a bad fit in terms of a school, but he does meet his wife, Nina Goma. They're married, and she joins him in Philadelphia. In the late 1890s, Philadelphia had the largest black population of any city in the North. 25% of this population lived in the 7th Ward. The 7th Ward would become the focus of Du Bois's great study, the Philadelphia Negro. Political corruption in the city was rife, racial prejudice was on the rise, It was a helpless victim of machine politics. In David Levering Lewis's words, in Philadelphia, the plutocracy left the business of government to the machine, and the machine left business to business, an arrangement leaving the rich to get incomparably richer, the politicians answerable largely to themselves, and the working classes with the crumbs of patronage. Thank God that exists. That situation doesn't persist to this day in this country in any form. Joking, of course. Progressive reformers sought to change this climate. There was interest in studying social problems, but differing ideas about what their causes were and how to alleviate them. So a study was commissioned of the black neighborhood of the 7th Ward, which, in that curious way that so often happens in American cities, abutted wealthier white neighborhoods. So there was interest in these leading progressive white citizens, but also a great deal of prejudice about what might be causing the criminality, the poverty, the disease, the squalor of the black area of town. They were infected with what David Levering Lewis calls eugenic nightmares. He goes on to say, Du Bois knew that his sponsors held a theory about the race to be studied. Du Bois knew that what the ulterior aims of his sponsors were, and he knew that he had to care. He set about then to write a study affirming and modifying, yet also significantly subverting the received sociological wisdom of the day. This is a time where unfortunate, underserved populations are largely blamed for their own misfortune because of these entrenched theories of social Darwinism. What Du Bois is setting to prove, what he knows, is what we now know as the existence of systemic inequality. What happens when you deny resources to certain populations? They will eventually resort to crime, they will seek relief in drugs and alcohol, and they will become desperate, they will become rageful. They will become locked in a sort of intergenerational spiral of decline. Du Bois had to prove that. The world was thinking wrong about race, he said, because it did not know. He would, he hoped, teach it to think right. He would also adopt a new approach. It seems obvious to this day that you would go out into the community you're studying to collect the data, but this wasn't necessarily the done thing. Academics toiled away in libraries, in ivory towers like this. They took representative samples. Herbert Apteker calculated that Du Bois spent some 835 hours interviewing approximately 2,500 households over a 3-month period beginning in August 1896. So no representative sampling for him. And then we're presented with that rather comical image that Saidiya Hartman makes a great deal of in her wonderful book. Bloody hell, what's it called? It'll come to me. Anyway, she presents this image of Du Bois going out with his 3-piece suit, his cane and his gloves, knocking on these doors, talking to people who are deeply suspicious, often very, very busy, and unsure of what he's getting at. You know, these are semi-literate people often, and they're very poor. And so Du Bois had to really use every ounce of his training to convince them to open up to him. The study, when it was finally published, helped make Du Bois an academic celebrity. He was clearly very, very proud of his work. In his posthumously published 1968 autobiography, he wrote, "I made a study of the Negro group so thorough that it has withstood the criticism of 40 years. It was a complete scientific study, an answer as could have then been given, with defective facts and statistics, one lone worker, and little money. It revealed the Negro group as a symptom, not a cause, as a striving, palpitating group, and not an inert, sick body of crime, as a long historic development and not a transient occurrence." It was a powerful learning experience for Du Bois writing this book, argues Elijah Anderson, and one that brought some disillusionment because it did not result in an appointment at the University of Pennsylvania, which he'd perhaps hoped for. In the long run, it would teach him that direct activism was a more powerful tool for affecting policy change, says Anderson, than academic studies. But there were still a few more steps on this journey. In David Levering Lewis's words, the book was remarkable because it was an example of the new empiricism that was fundamentally transforming the social sciences at the beginning of the 20th century. Although Du Bois's novel Sociological Insights, says David Levering-Lewis, would soon become conventional wisdom, as one of the last books of the 19th century and the first of the 20th century, the Philadelphia study would be a breakthrough achievement, an important and virtually solitary departure from the hereditarian theorizing of the times. In the midst of all of this, Du Bois's wife, Nina, gave birth to a son, Burckhardt, who was born on October the 2nd, 1897, just before the Du Boises moved to Atlanta from Philadelphia. He was doted on by his parents. Du Bois projected enormous hopes onto his son, seeing in him the future of the race. It was to Atlanta that Du Bois went next, and he wrote in an article that was published the following year words which I think speak to what he felt his mission was going to be at this new school, which had explicitly given him the mandate to undertake social studies in Georgia, the graduate student body to support him, and the resources to make it possible. Du Bois sets out his thinking in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences in an article called The Study of the Negro Problems, published in 1898. He says the phenomena of society are worth the most careful and systematic study, and whether or not this study may eventually lead to a systematic body of knowledge deserving the name of science, it cannot in any case fail to give the world a mass of truth worth the knowing. And here's the kernel: truth. Du Bois sees the white world poisoned by a fog of lies, the lies of social Darwinism, the lies of white supremacy, the lies of, the class system and wealth inequality and corruption. So this kernel of truth is one he fixes on in these years. However difficult, he says, it may be to know all about the Negro, it is certain that we can know vastly more than we do, and that we can have our knowledge in more systematic and intelligible form. As things are, our opinions upon the Negro are more matters of faith than of knowledge. Every schoolboy is ready to discuss the matter, and there are few men that have not settled convictions. Such a situation is dangerous. Whenever any nation allows impulse, whim, or hasty conjecture to usurp the place of conscious, normative, intelligent action, it is in grave danger. Whenever any nation allows impulse, whim, or hasty conjecture to usurp the place of conscious, normative, intelligent action, it is in grave danger. I think those words are worth repeating. Students must be careful to insist that science as such, be it physics, chemistry, psychology, or sociology, has but one simple aim: the discovery of truth. Its results lie open for the use of all men merchants, physicians, men of letters, and philanthropists, but the aim of science itself is simple truth. Any attempt to give it a double aim, to make social reform the immediate instead of the mediate object of a search for truth, will inevitably tend to defeat both objects. So, Du Bois is believing here thoroughly in the power of his study, of his science, to enact change in the world. The University of Atlanta, which here you get a sort of sense of, including this rather amazing photograph of Du Bois's classroom, really was a sort of haven in this sad and scary South of Jim Crow racism. James Weldon Johnson described it as a spot fresh and beautiful, a rest for the eyes from what surrounded it, a green island in a dull red sea. Du Bois was an interesting character as a teacher, that's for sure. He made a real impression. Some of them were put off by his manner and his affectations. Nevertheless, in the words of one, Kathleen Adams, quote, "You had to pay attention to him. When he entered the chapel, you looked at him and you followed him until he got to his seat and sat down." Some students began to call him Doob, but never to his face. In David Levering-Lewis's words, his lectures in the steepled old stone hall began precisely on the second, pocket watch on the lectern, and latecomers were barred without benefit of appeal. But of course, teaching was just one reason of the move. I've already mentioned that he was given this mandate, and this was in the form of the Atlanta University Studies, a 13-year series of conferences and sociological research projects, which were to be under Du Bois's direction. But something shook Du Bois. Two things, actually, from this path. Here he is, at Atlanta in his office, the image that he is projecting to the world and to his students at this time of the confident, young, intelligent, and determined professor, but still very explicitly in an academic setting. This would change. In 1899, two horrible things happened in Du Bois's life. The first was not something that happened directly to him, but something which affected every black person living in Atlanta, and that was the horrific lynching of a man named Sam Hose. Sam Hose had killed a white man in self-defense. He was hunted down and murdered by a mob of hundreds of white people who gleefully tortured him, burned his body, and dismembered his corpse. Du Bois writes later, he says that this, at the very time when my studies were most successful, there cut across this plan, which I had as a scientist, a red ray which could not be ignored. Du Bois decides he's going to write an op-ed in the local newspaper, the Atlanta Constitution. He's on his way to deliver a letter of introduction to the editor when he hears that Hose has been killed and that his body parts are on display in a shop window on Mitchell Street, down which Du Bois is walking. Now you have to consider at this time what that means, that a mob of several fellow citizens can, in brazen fashion, destroy the life of another person nominally protected by the law. And so, with such confidence that they're not going to see justice for this act, they can actually mock the surviving members of the black group with a display of horrific barbarism. This is what Du Bois is sort of partial witness to. And he says that the lynching of Sam Hose made him turn aside from his work. He says, two considerations broke in upon my work and eventually disrupted it. First, one could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. And secondly, there was no such definite demand for scientific work of the sort that I was doing. And what he's saying there is, obviously, this plan, this idea that it was going to be enough to be producing vivid and exciting scholarship that was going to change minds and result in broad change, it's not realistic. And that more worryingly than that, there's no actual desire to see this. He's already seen that once with the Philadelphia Negro, and perhaps this realization has only fully taken hold now in 1899. A month and a day later, Burckhardt Du Bois died of diphtheria. The young boy only managed to live to 18 months. Is not this dull land that stretches its sneering web about me cold enough, wrote Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk, is not all the world beyond these four little walls pitiless enough, but that thou must needs enter here, thou, O death. This event traumatized William Edward Burckhardt Du Bois and Nina, and stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Du Bois, at the old age of 95, which is what he lived to, could not speak about Burckhardt without choking up. And I think this portrait behind me tells you a story of how he saw Burckhardt. Behind Du Bois, you see Frederick Douglass. On the table, it's a portrait of his son. But what Du Bois is telling us here, and this is a posed photograph, is that he's standing in the shadow of his great forebear. But the reason he's doing what he's doing is here on the table, is the death of this boy whose death was avoidable, who at least would have been given medical treatment in the North, but in the South was denied that because of his race, because of the black codes, the Jim Crow laws. He was denied treatment in some ways by black doctors too, because black doctors were not allowed access to the best medical training. And besides which, the Du Boises had not really been in town long enough to form the connections needed. And many black doctors were fearful of treating light-skinned children like Burckhardt for fear that they would get in trouble. So this was a horrible, nasty tragedy. Its victim, a helpless infant. Nina's life was beset by mental health struggles. She never recovered. The marriage never really recovered. And all those hopes that Du Bois had for his son were dashed. And so it is as a grieving father that Du Bois goes to Paris just a year later. At this point, Nina is pregnant again with Yolande, a child that will survive to adulthood, but will carry also the scars of this, despite not being born when the trauma happened. So it is on this background, now knowing that science alone is not going to be enough, that we rejoin Du Bois in Paris. And he's a changed man, of course, from his first visit. He's still a Europhile, but he's way more cynical about white culture. He arrives, of course, in the France of the Dreyfus affair, and he's very attentive to the reports of increased and increasingly successful armed resistance by African peoples to European colonization. He says in his autobiography, "The details of finishing these 50 or more charts in colors with accuracy was terribly difficult, with little money, limited time, and not too much encouragement. I was threatened with nervous prostration before I was done, and had little money left to buy passage to Paris, nor was there a cabin left for sale. But the exhibit would fail unless I was there. So at the last moment, I bought passage in steerage and went over and installed the work. The exhibit was nestled in an unenviable location at the far right corner of the American Pavilion. It nevertheless captivated thousands of curious visitors over the months it was on display. It garnered a number of prizes, including a gold medal awarded to Du Bois by the Paris Exposition judges for his, quote, role as collaborator and compiler of materials for the exhibit. The exhibit itself featured an eclectic mix of objects, images, and texts, a bronze statuette of Frederick Douglass, a collection of over 250 publications by Black writers, agricultural products and tools from Black industrial schools, and photographs of prominent African-American leaders, including Booker T. Washington. Du Bois made the centerpiece, though, two unique sets of data visualization. His team, comprised of students and alumni from Atlanta University, created a selection of graphs, charts, maps, and tables that were generated from a mix of existing records and empirical data that had been collected through the Atlanta University studies. There were, of course, also photographs in the exhibit to go along with the data. So the people represented in numbers could also be seen in real images. So there were two data sets that I mentioned. There was the Georgia Negro, a social study created specifically for the exposition. Georgia had the largest Black population of any US state at this point. Du Bois and his team used Georgia's diverse and growing Black population to demonstrate the progress made by African Americans since the Civil War. The second set was more national, even global, one could say, in scope. A series of statistical charts illustrating the condition of the descendants of former African slaves now in residence in the United States, very pithy title, of America, included statistics related to employment and education, the distribution of the Black population across the US, and comparisons of literacy rates and other dramatic visualizations. The two sets are very much in dialogue with one another. This couldn't have happened without Du Bois's students, of course. He was one of the first professors in the US to train his students in sociological theory and empirical methodologies. He involved them in the fieldwork and had them collect and analyze the data on the Black community and race relations. The most advanced students became the most valued assistants in compiling the charts and the graphs, and many worked with Du Bois on the exhibit. It's a shame, though, that we don't know, none of these are signed. We don't know exactly who did these hand-painted, these wonderful, wonderful, artistic data visualizations. There is still research to be done there, if indeed that information exists. Du Bois is not always great at giving credit to other people. One consequence of having an ego as robust as his, I guess. And this is where this idea of modernity comes in, because you want you to look at these charts and think of them not as objects from the past, but think of yourself in 1900, if you can. Everyone viewing these was living at the most modern time it was possible to live. And furthermore, as well as not knowing anything about the future, as everyone in the past is living in the present, they also were, at this time, uniquely interested in the idea of modernity because, of course, this was the last century of the millennium, and there had been incredible technological advances. And so along with this social Darwinist impulse, the triumph of industrial nations and colonialism, there was also an excitement about technology, about motors, electricity, later on air travel. You know, the futurists and the fascists would famously adopt this technological obsession with modernity as a kind of cri de coeur. But you know, at this point, the idea of modernism is still somewhat in its infancy, but Du Bois is, in Rebecca Rutledge Fisher's words, alive to the possibilities in imagining the African American not simply as an American citizen, but as a citizen of the modern world. The graphs are made deliberately visually arresting, obviously, to appeal and to attract an audience, but they're also made geometric and colorful and angular to seem contemporary. There's nothing classical about these. The design shows that Du Bois thought of the Black South and wanted it to be seen as an integral part of modernity, with more in common with the international, future-oriented thinking world, quote unquote, than with the insular, backward-looking US. The images should be read, argues Fisher, as attempts to make attempts at Black American self-determination in the face of what Fanon refers to as overdetermination from without. I think very cleverly, Du Bois also included a 3-volume compilation of the Black codes of Georgia from the slave codes of the colonial and antebellum periods right up to the Jim Crow present, to demonstrate the gains made in spite of oppression. So there's a real narrative going on here. There's a visual story. There's a story in the data. And then if you need to, you can refer to photographs. You can refer also to the documented evidence of racial apartheid in the form of the Black codes. These graphs and all the information, as I say, they demonstrate these gains made in spite of oppression. Du Bois is arguing that if the world wanted to know what a disadvantaged people could do for itself, there was no more encouraging answer than, quote, that given by the American Negroes who are here shown to be studying, examining, and thinking of their own progress and prospects. And I'll give you some more of the wonderful hand-drawn data portraits here. It's also worth noting that this, after Paris, went on tour. And so many of the people who were represented in the data could see it. And so this is another thing that is modern, is new. Is that data, rather than being presented purely for an academic audience, is here being presented for a broad audience. It's democratizing access to knowledge. It's making data legible, especially to those whom it was collected from. This is a new idea. This is an idea that's still with us in news broadcasts and on the internet and in textbooks and in every other form we can think of, in doctors' offices and anywhere where people need to understand complex information. Visualizing it is key. Du Bois is a pioneer of this. The exhibit was a success because it showed Black Americans as learned, accomplished, socially mobile, and confident. It violated white thoughts about Black people, especially Americans, only 3 decades removed from slavery. And I think it's also important to reflect then on this being in Paris, on this taking place on so-called sort of neutral territory, away from America. I always think about that story of Woodrow Wilson and his wife going to Paris without their Black servant because they didn't want their attendants to see the more racially permissive atmosphere of Europe and get ideas above their stations. So they left them at home. This is a chance for Du Bois to do what he'd done in Germany, to step out of the noxious atmosphere of American racial apartheid. And despite the presence of European racism, of course, we're not glorifying Europe to any extent here, he is able to make a statement bolder, braver, and bigger than he could have made in the US at this point. This is a direct refutation, as I've said, of social Darwinist theory. Black populations are in these graphs increasing and not decreasing. They're making progress. they're attaining education, they're attaining property and land. You're foreshadowing here. I mean, look at every one of these graphs. You see them, these models you see every day. They're foreshadowing new possibilities in communicating sociological knowledge to the wider public. And I love this quote from the book published by Whitney Battle-Baptiste and Britt Russett of UMass Amherst. The cross-fertilization of visual art and social science here marks an important transitional moment in the history of the disciplines while offering alternative visions of how social scientific data might be made more accessible to the populations and people from whom such data is collected. I think we can use Paris as a case study of Du Bois's career at this point, and perhaps even more broadly. Case methods are effective as they reveal nuances of phenomena not attainable in a general study. In Alden Morris's words, it allows the analyst to provide specificity to accompany macro-level analysis. So I like to extrapolate from this quite a great deal about what Du Bois is trying to say, both about the value and the importance of science, the truth it can tell, the statements it can make visually, the statements it can make rhetorically, but also I think biographically, we need to see here this turning point in Du Bois's life from he is no longer the academic in the ivory tower writing for academic audiences, seeking to impress academic audiences. No, he is now seeing that change will be made if the broadest number of people can be engaged and excited and can understand what is going on. I love the Du Boisian idea that he presents in The Souls of Black Folk of the present past. And there's a piece in this exhibit that speaks to that. One chart, I don't know which one, was exhibited in a wooden frame which had been carved by a former slave who lived in Atlanta. This is making the past present. It is using slavery quite literally to frame the present. And I think you can see in all of this double consciousness that Du Bois has as well. This, again, seeing how the white world sees Black people, but also seeing Black people for who they really are. And so in this exhibit, he's also, as much as he's making the work accessible to all audiences, he's also speaking to the powers that be. And he is showing how rigorous, how thorough the data is, how utterly unimpeachable his scholarship is. So there's a couple more for you. This feature of, this again, coming back to this case study, this idea of the facts that fly in the face of the assumptions and arguments of gatekeepers and guardians of culture and education and knowledge is an entire feature of Du Bois's career. And we're going to talk about this idea of propaganda in just a second. Du Bois's team here, in the words again of Whitney Battle-Baptiste and Britt Russett, are using clean lines, bright color, and a sparse style to convey the American color line to a European audience. But I think they're also letting this color line bounce back onto an American audience as well. This is such a clear statement of intent, and it is a truly, I think, remarkable aesthetic one. And again, flying in the face, because we talked about this idea of modernism. What's going on at this time is the birth of modern art and Cubism. And so we think about people like Picasso as the pioneers of modern aesthetic culture, even modern intellectual culture. And yet so much of what Picasso produces is, in Robert Hughes's phrase, a small parody of the imperial model, because he's, as we can see here, using African motifs to create a new style of painting. It's nothing more, again to use a Robert Hughes phrase, than cultural plunder. Picasso has no interest in the objects for what they really are and what they represent, only as aesthetic pieces that allow him to free himself from formal painterly practice and become more abstract. Of course, later on in the 20th century, you see an increasingly geometrical form. And so I think there's something anticipatory in the data visualizations. Cubism begins with primitivism, morphs into these later patterns. Du Bois's team went right past the problematic Orientalism and primitivism of turn of the century modern art and created an aesthetic that would still look modern in the mid-century, into the 1920s and beyond. And this idea is one that Du Bois comes back to in the 1920s, the idea of art as propaganda. There's a speech he writes in 1926. It says, "It is the bounden duty of Black America to begin this great work of the creation of beauty, of the preservation of beauty, of the realization of beauty. And we must use in this work all the methods that men have used before. And what have been the tools of the artist in times gone by? First of all, he has used the truth. Not for the sake of truth, not as a scientist seeking truth, but as one upon whom truth eternally thrusts itself as the highest handmaid of imagination, as the one great vehicle of universal understanding. Again, artists have used goodness in all its aspects of justice, honor, and right, not for the sake of an ethical sanction, but as the one true method of gaining sympathy and human interest. The apostle of beauty thus becomes the apostle of truth and right, not by choice, but by inner and outer compulsion. Thus, all art is propaganda and ever must be, despite the wailing of the purists. I stand in utter shamelessness and say that whatever art I have has been used always for propaganda, for gaining the right of Black folk to love and enjoy. I do not care a damn for any art that is not used for propaganda," said Du Bois, "but I do care when propaganda is confined to one side while the other is stripped and silent." So think about how we think about the popular imagination interprets the development of the modern style. Why not include Du Bois's data visualizations in that? Why only think about Picasso and his colleagues? Du Bois might not have made the connection in 1926, but we could think about these data visualizations as being data as art, and then draw that line to art and propaganda. They exist in the present. I'm so proud of my friend and colleague Anthony Starks, who I hope is watching. Hi, Anthony, if you are. Who is one of the drivers behind the contemporary Du Bois Challenge, the hashtag Du Bois Challenge, as it takes place online, where Anthony and others have created templates which you can use to populate with any data that you wish. And the templates are based on the data visualizations, as you can see. So this is a way of, again, showing the timelessness of what Du Bois was able to produce in 1900. Also showing that there's no real difference between now and then in terms of how these data sets are modeled visually. So the modernity point still stands. But what I love about this is it gets people involved. It gets people excited about data. It gets people excited about Du Bois and what data can do. And so people engage in this challenge online. They produce their own, because none of this is owned by anyone. This, people take it, they run with it. And, I urge you to investigate if you're interested in this sort of thing, because it really is such a fantastic way of, really applying Du Bois to the contemporary moment, which is such a central feature of everything that we try and do here at the Du Bois Center. Finally, I would not be long in this job if I did not recommend my boss's book. Whitney produced this wonderful volume in collaboration with Britt Russett in 2018. There they are at the book launch. And it was the first time that all of the data sets were presented in color together in a book. And it is an indispensable volume for any bookshelf, and it is available where all good books are sold. So too is The Scholar Denied by Alden Morris. And I've of course also quoted extensively from David Levering-Lewis's 2-volume biography of Du Bois, which is invaluable for piecing together the life narrative and the personal side of Du Bois. He takes this idea of the public intellectual and he runs with it. Helps found the Niagara Movement in 1905. He joins the NAACP when it's founded. And there he is in the second row, marching next to James Weldon Johnson in 1917, really bringing public intellectual leadership onto the activist plane, becoming a social justice advocate with a great reserve of knowledge and training behind him. He embodies the idea of the public intellectual social justice leader. Never more so, of course, than in the Crisis magazine, which Du Bois edits for a quarter of his life, and which is full of the kind of aesthetic choices that you see in the Paris show, and full of the kind of propaganda, the truth-seeking through artistic and visual and visionary and literary and poetical styles that you see in 1900. He goes on fighting for justice, facing trial through his 80s, and of course he dies the day before the March on Washington in 1963. The speaker that day, one of the speakers that day, most famously, was Martin Luther King, and one of his last speeches was in 1968 on what would have been Du Bois's 100th birthday. And there, King said, history cannot ignore W.E.B. Du Bois because history has to reflect truth, and Dr. Du Bois was a tireless explorer and a gifted discoverer of social truths. His singular greatness lay in his quest for truth about his own people. There were very few scholars who concerned themselves with honest study of the black man, and he sought to fill this immense void. The extent to which he succeeded discloses the great dimensions of the man. Thank you very much. I guess we have time for questions if there are any.
I mean, there's a million things I want to say, and I always want to turn it back to South Africa, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'll turn it to my other conversation, Afrofuturism, and just like thinking about the visualizations in relation to another 1920s thing, which was the comic, the short story, the sci-fi short story that,
yes,
kind of thinking through what this experience of like a black future, a black technological future as imagined by these futures will feel like for a black person. And yeah, it's just, I don't know. Every time you show or speak about that, it strikes a chord for me in like very concrete and material ways, just in how I relate to, thinking about his work in relation to this moment for a black person in this country, but in South Africa and elsewhere as well. So there's no question there, just, I don't know, just wondering,
As ever with Du Bois, there are other lines, there are through lines.
Yeah.
You would point out the Comet, which is his short story, which many people have said anticipates Afrofuturism as a genre. And it's art as propaganda.
Yeah.
It's thinking of race and racism in a speculative fiction way, in a futuristic way, but also it's applying the issue of race to this tricky idea of modernism, because that is a modern short story written with modern techniques about a modern fear, annihilation through space. It's H.G. Wells. It's it's always raising the issue of black people instead of being, and of other non-white oppressed populations throughout the world, as instead of them being somehow a product of the past, of resisting the noble savage narrative, resisting the social Darwinist narrative, to thrust non-white populations and black people here specifically into a modern understanding. That is Du Bois's project. And you're obviously right to point out the connection, to put this in a global context. Du Bois's next visit to Paris, I think I'm right in saying, will be after 1900, will be in 1919, where he goes over and he, with Blaise Diagne and others, founds the Pan-African Congress, which starts to really coalesce this idea of throwing off European colonialism. So I thank my colleague from South Africa, Wilton, for his words, and I will use this opportunity to plug the fact that he has himself the opportunity to be at this podium in a few short weeks in March, where you'll be talking about the connections between Du Bois and South Africa. So I know that was not your intended outcome at that point, but I couldn't resist it. And that's, what is it, March the 10th? March the 10th at noon in this room and online. Yes, another question.
As his viewpoints change, does it impact the visuals he was creating as well, or there is not a significant shift or anything like that?
I think so, because I don't think there's a time in Du Bois's life after 1900 where he is as thoroughly enmeshed in the world of sociology and in empiricism and in data. So as much as this represents a kind of cresting point of every theory he's had, every idea he's had about data collection and data science and the science of studying social groups, he, at the end of the 1910s, has become so much more and a completely different figure in the landscape of American thought. Now he is an influencer in journalistic form, in narrative, long-form prose in The Souls of Black Folk, but also in the Crisis magazine, which he writes these editorials for, and which has its own aesthetic, which is more Art Nouveau, more linked to the Harlem Renaissance, and which, again, perhaps abandoning some of the principles of Paris, starts to embrace more traditional African motifs as well. So it's, but again, this is, the Crisis. It's a magazine by and for Black Americans. Why shouldn't it do that? The Paris show is seeking to do other things. The Paris show is insurgent. The Crisis is a force that is intended to gather people to its to its flag, and does so. But yeah, Du Bois doesn't ever, I don't think, return. But what is really interesting, if I go back to this image of his classroom in Atlanta, is if you look carefully, and why this is interesting is because this photograph, I cheated, is actually from when he goes back to Atlanta in the 1930s. Sorry. But there you have a graph, very similar in terms of its style to the Paris infographic. So it shows that he never abandoned them, and he did those charts and everything. I'll go back and hide behind my lectern again. They're all with the Library of Congress. The American Pavilion, the American government kept them, and Du Bois tried to get them back, and they didn't let him. They're not with us in this building where they should be. But they are fully available for now, digitally, through the Library of Congress, and I encourage you to have a look. But yeah, so he did very much care about them, but they weren't something that he came back to. They do frequently adorn the covers of not just Whitney's magnificent books, available where all books are sold, but also other Du Bois volumes, a recent edition of Darkwater. This style has become a kind of synecdoche, I guess, for Du Bois's whole career. Any other questions, thoughts? We've heard the bell for 6 p.m. Is it time to go off into the night? Thank you very much again for coming, and I really appreciate your time and the excellent questions. Thank you very much.